Mr. Deputy Chairman, I rise to support the bill. The bill deals with some of the practical problems of implementation of a very useful measure. Till 1948 in this country, we had the legislation to deal with the minimum wage problem. All wages, particularly minimum wages, in the country were fixed by tribunals, and earlier than the tribunals, they were fixed by some commodities. We in Uttar Pradesh, for example, had the good fortune of the minimum wage of textile labor in Kanpur being fixed by a committee in 1938, over which Dr. Rajendra Prasad, now the President of India himself, presided. Full stop. In Bombay, they had a committee with Mr. Jairam Das Daulatram as chairman, and that committee fixed the minimum wages. That was the pattern of fixation of minimum wages till 1948. But then this pattern, this sort of inquiry was not a feature of the day-to-day life of the workers of the country. Only in case the workers were vocal, only in case the workers were organized and demanded the fixation of a minimum wage, the government took the unusual step of appointing an inquiry committee, which took years. The recommendations did not have any statutory force behind them. The reports of those committees were important documents which prepared public opinion, and when it was for the workers and the employers to try their strength, the workers had public opinion behind them. The Act of 1948 was a step in the right direction, a step in accordance with the convention of the ILO, which makes it necessary that minimum wages should be fixed. This act was a remarkable piece of legislation because it provided protection and help to workers who were by the very nature of their employment, by the very nature of the industries in which they were employed, not in a position to organize themselves sufficiently strongly, were not in a position to win a minimum wage for themselves by their own organized strength, as workers in the Ahmedabad and Bombay textile industry did long ago. The Minimum Wages Act was an act to help the poorest, the most downtrodden sections of the toiling population of our country. Many industries in this country were prospering and sweated labor, and this act made it necessary for them to pay minimum wages. These minimum wages only provided them with the barest means of subsistence, and it was very necessary that it should have been done. This legislation was of course necessary because the workers in most of these industries which are mentioned in parts 1 and 2 of the schedule in the parent act were not organized enough. The Act of 1948 has not been implemented as expeditiously and as widely as we would like. There are certain industries like the tannery industry in Uttar Pradesh where the minimum wages have not been fixed in spite of the fact that the act is 13 years old. There are other instances also from other states in the case of agricultural labor, and the progress has been much slower than it was expected, though the original act in 1958 laid it down that the minimum wages for agricultural and industrial workers should be fixed within 3 years. Sir, it is now 13 years since the act came into being, and we find that even after these 13 years in the case of agricultural labor, we have not done what was originally intended to be done in 3 years. There are undoubtedly a number of practical difficulties, but there is also a fact to be reckoned with that all the state governments are not equally enthusiastic about fixation of minimum wages for agricultural labor. It is correct to say that it will be no use fixing minimum wages and not being able to enforce them, but that was something which was taken into consideration when the original bill was considered. When the Minimum Wages Act of 1948 was enacted, all this was taken into consideration. It is only reasonable to expect that minimum wages for agricultural labor will be fixed as quickly as possible, and that those states which have not done so will be pulled up by the center as best as the center can. The present bill mainly deals with that situation. It is correct, sir. As has been stated in the statement of objects and reasons of the bill, in the case of those industries in the schedule, that those suited industries for which this act was meant, quite a substantial percentage of workers has been covered, but the same cannot be said for agricultural labor. It would have been much better if the government was in a position to say the same about agricultural labor. It is because of lack of enthusiasm on the part of the state governments that our labor ministry has come to this house. Mr. Deputy Chairman, I must admit that I am not very happy regarding this particular bill. The Honorable Minister has told the House that whenever the President took the authority under Article 356 of the Constitution and whenever there was the President's proclamation, every time such a bill was brought forward before Parliament and Parliament approved that bill. It is true, but at the same time, it is also true that this kind of routine, which is now being followed from time to time, is creating a situation in which Parliament, which is given a very important function under Article 356 of the Constitution, is divesting itself of that function. In order to fully appreciate, sir, the significance of such a move, it is necessary to go into the history of this sort of powers that were conferred on Parliament by the Constitution in the past. Sir, under the Government of India Act 1935 under section 93, some such situation was contemplated and certain provisions were made in such a situation arose either at the center or in some of the provinces as they were called at that time. At that time, it was decided that the Governor General should have both the executive as well as the legislative power in his hands in case such a situation arose either at the center or in the provinces. Now the farmers of the Constitution have not accepted that particular formula when our Constitution was framed and have definitely made a distinction between the executive power and the legislative power, and they have stated that as far as executive power is concerned, the President can straightway take these powers into his hands through a proclamation, but as far as legislative powers are concerned, these powers vest in Parliament. The Constitution provides that Parliament in its turn might delegate these powers to the President or to some authority to be named by him, but obviously when this distinction between the executive and the legislative power was made in the Constitution, it is reasonable to suppose that only under exceptional circumstances the Parliament was to delegate that power to the President again or to any authority to be named by him. If it was intention of the farmers of the constitutions that the legislative as well as the executive power should vest in the President himself, then the scheme which was envisaged in section 93 of the Government of India Act would have been copied in the Constitution. The very fact that it has not been done clearly shows that the farmers of the Constitution expect Parliament to exercise the legislative power, and only in exceptional circumstances should this power be delegated to the President or to any authority to be named by him. This was to my mind the real intention and the real scheme as it is envisaged in the Constitution. But what do we find whenever there is a proclamation? Automatically this bill is brought and passed by Parliament and the powers are vested in the President. What is the necessity of the ritual to be gone through at the time of every proclamation whereby the Parliament might divest itself of its power the moment it has got it? There seems to be no sense in this type of ritual to be gone through after every proclamation. It has been stated that this becomes necessary because of the fact that Parliament might not have sufficient time to consider the various bills, and therefore it is desirable that this power should be vested in the President. Again, I ask the same question: were not the farmers of the Constitution aware of the fact that there was the function which Parliament had to perform regarding the central government, and that Parliament might not find time to look into the legislative matters of the territories? The executive power and the legislative power for which have been taken away by the center. Here again, the very effect that the Constitution is passed is proof that Parliament is supposed to function as originally envisaged, and it clearly shows that the Constitution expects this Parliament to find time to discharge its functions. I am not at all satisfied that there would not be sufficient time for this Parliament to go into the various problems that are connected with the exercise of the legislative power. powers which were originally in the legislature and which were because of the proclamation vested in parliament. We have been told that there are certain bills which are to be gone through and that this house adjourned earlier and the two houses might not be in session simultaneously and therefore these difficulties might arise. May I ask the Honorable Minister, does not the same argument also apply to the legislative business as far as the centre is concerned? The centre has to go through a large number of legislative measures. There are all sorts of bills coming up. Full stop. Over.